our Western armed forces are not as competent as we usually think that they are, not in major warfare. Other analysts have noted the probability of European countries running out of ammunition after a couple of weeks of high intensity warfare. And that's probably true for pretty much every single European country. And that doesn't really instill confidence as a sign of substantial competence. Yes, we laugh at the Russian army, but some more cautious commentators have been saying that if we were in their position, at least in certain scenarios, we wouldn't necessarily do much better. And that is a bit worrisome.
This is a conversation with Lukas Milevski, a professor at Leiden University and an expert on strategy and the issue of Baltic defense and security. In this conversation, we talk in depth about what would Russian invasion of the Baltics look like, whether it could succeed, and how likely it actually is. Thank you to everyone who supports this podcast on Patreon. And now, enjoy the conversation. So, I think it's quite fair to say that the Baltic countries have been very aware of the Russian threat way before the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and they took it much more seriously than most, at least most in Europe. But I still imagine that what happened when Russia invaded Ukraine must have had a momentous consequences for them in terms of changing their mindset and strategic thinking, and both in terms of their practical measures that they've implemented. So maybe a good way to start would be by talking about how did things change for the Baltic countries in terms of their perception since the Russian invasion, and what have they done in response since then?
Okay, yeah, so as you rightly point out, the Baltic states have pretty much always been serious about Russia. They've always recognized the danger of Russia. That's why they joined NATO in the first place. But NATO's expeditionary focus in the 2000s and 2010s, combined with the 2008 financial crisis, I think it's fair to say to hamstring Baltic defense developments. That did change after 2014 because of the Russian invasion and annexation of Crimea. And after which Lithuania reintroduced conscription, Estonia had never gotten rid of it, all Baltic states surpassed 2% of GDP dedicated to defense, and generally they began expanding their military capabilities again from that year onward after quite a few years of quite impoverished defense budgets. But 2022 did instill a new sense of urgency among the Baltic states. But crucially, that year and since has also clarified the threat which Russia can pose and what capabilities are useful to fight back against Russia. Mass has become increasingly and recognizably more important again. So Latvia is in the process of reintroducing conscription. And the NATO Enhanced Forward Presence Forces are being expanded from battalion to brigade size. So from about 1,000 men to 5,000-ish. Infrastructure is being upgraded and expanded to allow for easier movement and easier basing of hypothetically reinforcing NATO forces into as well as across the Baltic states. Besides all this, the Baltic states are also procuring new military capabilities. So Latvia and Estonia, for example, have jointly purchased an Iris-T medium-range air defense system, which should begin being delivered in 2026. Latvia and Estonia are both buying coastal defense missiles, different kinds. All three Baltic states have individually procured HIMARS, which we've seen be so useful in Ukraine, together also with long-range ATACMS rockets. Most recently, the Baltic states have unveiled a plan to build a defensive line along the border, at the very least to slow down any Russian invasion. Now, this is really only the briefest overview of their defense projects and procurements. I'll talk about a bit more a bit later. But as you might imagine, defense budgets are growing to keep pace with these expenditures. Estonia, at the very least, is now aiming to hit 3% of GDP in the next few years, which is quite substantial. In terms of their strategic thinking, obviously they have to work within the sort of framework of NATO defense planning. And much of that does occur behind closed doors, so I can't say too much about it. But from everything I've read, it does seem to be the focus on trying to delay any hypothetical Russian advance. The idea is the Baltic states presumably cannot on their own defend themselves against a full Russian invasion, but if they can at least slow down a Russian invasion long enough that NATO can reinforce effectively, that fits in within NATO defense plans.
I think I definitely want to talk in more detail about a lot of things that you've just hinted on, but one thing that I need to point out immediately is you've mentioned that their strategy in case of a conflict, I guess what both NATO and Baltic militaries are preparing for is sort of slowing the Russians down enough to buy time. But I thought that the opposite is now the strategy, where that used to be the strategy before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but after the Baltic states have seen what happens to occupied territories in Ukraine, the new strategy is to basically hold and not give even an inch. Is that correct?
Yes and no. So in principle, the answer is yes. The NATO does not intend officially, certainly, to give up a single inch, a single centimeter of any alliance territory, including on the Baltic states. But in practice, the forces currently stationed in the Baltic states do not seem, even once the enhanced forward presence battle groups expand to brigade size, will probably be insufficient to hold the Russians at the border by themselves. I did mention the defensive line. I think I'll be talking about that in more detail later, but nonetheless, clearly something like that will help in terms of the defending. But there does need to be a further influx of there would have to be a further influx of NATO forces into the Baltic states were Russia actually to invade. So in that sense, it is still buying time so that reinforcements can arrive. If they can do that without giving up territory, then that's perfect. But that is probably quite a tall order to try to achieve.
Maybe a good way to talk about it, since we're talking about what the preparations and the defenses might look like, is to talk about what is it actually, what they're preparing for and what might the most likely scenarios look like. Because I assume from also conversations that I've had with other experts before is that you sort of have two different scenarios, and one is sort of a larger outright invasion, and one is sort of maybe a limited engagement where Russia would be testing the cohesion of NATO and what the NATO response would actually be. So from the Baltic perspective, what are the most likely scenarios or the most probable scenarios that they're structuring their militaries and their defense strategies to prepare for?
So this is something that I've written about before, about thinking through the logic of hypothetical Russian attacks. And I still agree with my thoughts, so I'll sort of lay out my thinking for you. And these come from an article which I wrote for the Lithuanian Annual Strategic Review back in 2019. So a few years ago now. But there I discussed three potential scenarios. The so-called hybrid warfare, the ambiguous invasion scenario, a limited but still overt invasion, and then a full-on invasion. So first of all, I basically derided the ambiguous invasion scenario. I don't think it would make strategic sense for the Russians. My sense is that it was a gimmick. It worked once well in Crimea back in 2014, but it won't work again because we know how it ends. So we'll respond to it in that light. NATO has ascertained that this sort of ambiguous invasion scenario does fall under Article 5. So unless NATO suffers a fatal loss of political will, it won't work.
And by that scenario, you sort of mean the little green men in Crimea.
Yes. It's an invasion, but people are pretending it's not an invasion. It's just locals and vacationers and this sort of stuff. So a strong NATO reaction to this sort of ambiguous invasion then forces an unfavorable decision on the Russians. Either they escalate to try to get out of this disadvantageous situation, or they back off and lose credibility with any potentially willing agents or proxies. So it doesn't really make sense, because it should provoke a major and armed NATO reaction without giving the Russians any advantage, and even putting them at disadvantage. So the second plausible scenario is a more limited incursion. I think that's sort of what you were alluding to, perhaps, with the testing NATO resolve. And I feel that this has basically all the same basic problems of the ambiguous invasion, and more besides, because it's not even pretending to be ambiguous. But it's still not being done in a way to guarantee military success. So it just seems like too much of a political and strategic gamble. Incidentally, as an aside, this is also what I came to believe in late January and February of 2022 about the upcoming, at that point still upcoming, Russian invasion of Ukraine. I didn't feel like that there was any sensible reason for it to be this sort of precise and limited invasion. The Russians would go for broke. So that leaves the third scenario, outright major invasion. Because I feel only major invasion has the qualities which presents something which is at all a favorable scenario for the Russians. Most notably military strength. Because if Russia is going to offend the entirety of the NATO alliance, it better do so in real force, right from the start. Because war occurs almost no matter what, unless the Russians back down very quickly. And I feel like the renewed Russian invasion of Ukraine from February 22 onward does confirm this argument, which I made in 2019. They went in, at least in part, because they got frustrated that their subversion and their original ambiguous invasion had not and were not working in the way that they wanted those things to work. Their initial invasion was substantial, though it was still kind of limited in a sense and kind of weird in that regard, and totally failed along the most important axis of advance toward Kyiv. And the result is a full-scale war in which Russia is taking horrific losses, but still perceives that it might yet meaningfully win, especially if it's accompanied by a perceived failure of Western political will. Of course, with American aid now beginning to flow again, we'll see how that affects things. And moreover, Russia is unlikely to repeat the mistakes that it made in Ukraine with the Baltic states. So my sense is it'll either keep up a general low-risk subversion with hardly any chance of major geopolitical success, but just to keep sort of like annoying the Baltic states, or go all in with an invasion. Although even if the Russian leadership were willing to consider the latter, and to consider it seriously, I do not believe that they would or could really do so before recovering from their current war with Ukraine.
I definitely want to talk about the scenario of a full-scale invasion, since you consider it the most probable, and it would also be the most devastating, so it makes sense to focus on it. But before that, just to ask about the second scenario of a limited incursion, because I feel the benefit of this scenario from a Russian perspective is that you could theoretically try to move soldiers, maybe under some pretense, to Narva over a bridge or to some border village, and then not escalate further and wait to see if the allies would be willing to, start a major conflict with Russia over the Baltic countries, and hope that actually they might break at that point and try to de-escalate.
with regard to sort of this very, very sort of salami slicing scenario, for a bit of alliteration, I don't think that it would work for the Russians, because the Baltic states have a very particular political and strategic culture now, which they've had really since they regained independence at when the Soviet Union collapsed. Which is, and this is something which has also confronted and shocked Western observers and soldiers, participants in military exercises, and so on. And it very much stems from the Balts' own, or the Baltic experience of their own history, which is that in 1939, 1940, they did not shoot back against the Russians when they came in. And there's been all three countries have had a sense, especially with the case of Finland occurring at basically the same time, the Winter War, there's been a sense of sort of national regret that they did not, which means the lesson that they learned is never again. If the Russians come in, they will be shot. So this sort of limited scenario will escalate very quickly because the Balts will respond with armed force, and then so the rest of the alliance will be dragged in behind them because the shooting war has already started. And this is something that as I mentioned, exercises. This is something which came out in one naval exercise. I don't remember what year it was, involving, at the very least, the Lithuanians and the Americans. And the idea was behind the exercise was some sort of maritime hybrid warfare scenario. Suspicious Russian ships in the Lithuanian EEZ, possibly threatening to cut cables, this sort of stuff. Lithuanian ship, American ship come close to try to scare the Russians off or get them to leave. And then all of a sudden, communications blackout, something goes wrong, and the Russians threaten to escalate in some way or whatever. And the Lithuanians in the exercise start firing. And this shocks the Americans because they're used to something more, perhaps a slower buildup of sort of escalation management. But again, this is just a reflection of the Baltic sense of never again. If in doubt, shoot the Russians.
That's really interesting. I gotta say, I had a chance to visit Estonia and talk to Estonian officials, including those who work in the Ministry of Defense there, and the message of never again was very much echoed there as well. So I guess what you're saying is that even if other NATO allies might be potentially susceptible to the Russian salami slicing tactics, which are a notorious Russian strategy, the Baltic states themselves would see that miles away, and they would immediately escalate to avoid letting it go without a fight.
Yes, because they know how it ends.
So let's talk about the third scenario, maybe, of a full-scale invasion. Is there an idea of what that scenario, what that invasion might look like, or what might be its most likely form? What would be its first targets, and maybe whether it would resemble the invasion of Ukraine in any way, with a quick, direct strike at the heart, at the capital, and trying to control the countries that way?
So I think there's a bit of a debate ongoing about what it looks like. And again, I don't know what occurs behind closed doors or anything like that. And this sort of goes back to what I said about the 2022 invasion and how it was limited in a kind of weird way. But that Russia's re-invasion of Ukraine in 2022 was premised fundamentally on the notion that the Ukrainians would not actually resist. Hence why they were able to take such extreme sort of operational risks of trying to fly in the VDV to Hostomel airport to try to drive, hell for leather toward Kyiv to the point that their battalion tactical groups were literally disintegrating. And were no longer presented any sort of coherent force because the tanks were just driving as quickly as possible forward. That is a very, very distinct and, of course, as we know, deluded political assumption underpinning the military planning, which would in no way, shape, or form correspond with Russian expectations of the Baltic states. The Russians are very aware of Baltic hostility and Baltic suspicion of the Russians and so on and so forth. So there is a bit of a debate as to what degree should the Baltic states be thinking about potential Russian coup de main, like Hostomel Airport style, flying in VDV into Amari Air Force Base or Leopolda in Latvia and whatever else, or the national, or the capital airports in Vilnius, Riga, and Tallinn. But that would leave those forces, except to a certain degree, with Lithuania, given how close Vilnius is to the Belarusian border, hugely under-supported operationally. And the results could well be like Hostomel, but worse for the Russians. So although it's clearly a good idea to hedge against the possibility of that sort of very quick coup de main strike, hence perhaps why the Baltic states, or Latvia and Estonia, have purchased the IRIS-T air defense system. Lithuania, I think, has NASAMS. I think just the Russians would be more likely to just start from the border and go by land and try to push in a more systematic way. Because that makes the most sense given their political assumptions about the Baltic states as compared to their mistaken ones about Ukraine.
And I guess it would be, in a sense, maybe a lot easier for them in the case of Baltic states, because they don't have the advantage that Ukraine had, which is the sheer size of the territory, where it takes time for the Russians to get from the border to the capital, and they need to stretch out their lines and their logistics. That makes them vulnerable. And Ukraine is also able to trade territory for time. Whereas in the Baltics, they don't have this strategic depth. And so I guess my assumption is they're much more vulnerable.
Yes and no, I'd say. And so the question of strategic depth of the Baltic states is, I feel like this is a topic which has become increasingly prominent since 2022. I don't really remember it being discussed much when it came to Baltic defense prior to that year. And it's just sort of, the assumption is that they have no strategic depth, and that's a problem, and so on and so forth. But I think, I have a few problems with this argument. One is that no one really defines what strategic defense actually, or strategic depth rather, actually is. How much depth is enough? Okay, if we're talking from the Belarusian border to Vilnius, that's like 35 kilometers. That's not enough, clearly. But if you measure along the most direct road from Pskov to Riga, that's like 240 kilometers. That will take time to cross. Tallinn is, of course, again, closer, but nonetheless, it's still some distance. And even if you look at the most effective Ukrainian counterattack of the war, which is Kharkiv in September of 2022, their vanguard forces crossed 90 kilometers in 4 days. And after that point, that's basically reaching the limits of human endurance. They also reached certain geographical boundaries, the Oskil River, and they just basically came to a temporary stop. So even if you take 90 kilometers in 4 days and assume that to be the Russian pace of advance, And that would then assume a complete collapse of defense in the Baltic states, which wouldn't happen, not that quickly. You get a bit over a third of the way to Riga. Vilnius does fall. Tallinn is also not yet reached, though it's cutting it a bit finer. This is actually a topic that I want to explore in more detail in research later this year, so maybe ask me the question again in a year's time. But I do think that the talk about the Baltic states lacking strategic depth is both currently too sort of intellectually sloppy, and it's ignoring the quite distinct geographies of all three Baltic states, in a way, and sort of generalizing on them in a way which is not necessarily appropriate.
I think another topic that we need to talk about, and that has become very prominent since the Russian invasion, is the issue of the Suwalki Gap and its role in a potential Russian invasion of the Baltics. So can you maybe explain what is it actually, and why does it matter, and how important it would be in this scenario, and whether it would be as important as we hear about quite often these days?
So the whole notion of the Suwalki Gap, or if you want to follow Ben Hodges' insistence, we should call it the Suwalki Corridor, because the implication is a gap is there to be closed, but we don't want Suwalki to be closed. We want to remain open so we can go through it, hence a corridor. But nonetheless, that's just a bit of semantics. The notion behind the concern about Suwalki is that this is the only land route from Poland and sort of, if you like, the mainland NATO to the sort of exposed peninsula of the Baltic states. Otherwise, reinforcements would have to come in by sea or by air, both of which are a concern or are perhaps dubious, given, especially sort of in the 2014 to 2018 period, there's a lot of concern about Russian anti-access area denial capabilities based in Kaliningrad, both in terms of the Navy and anti-ship missiles, as well as the S-400s, and being able to deny access via the sky. So the notion was those avenues would presumably already be closed, no matter what, because of Kaliningrad, and therefore Suwalki would be the only way to funnel NATO forces into the Baltic states to reinforce them. Hence why it's so important, or it's been so important in the discourse surrounding NATO defense of the Baltic states, and presumably also in NATO defense planning. What we have seen, however, two things, both consequences of the war. What we've seen is Finland and now finally Sweden have joined NATO. So the Baltic Sea is now a NATO lake. In case of war, the Russian Navy or the Baltic Sea Fleet is not going to be able to sneeze without drawing NATO missile fire down on it. So it's almost useless for them to be there. As for the S-400s, they've proven to be somewhat less of sort of an air denial wonder weapon than we had perhaps feared prior to the war, given that how the way that S-400s have also been suffering in the fighting against Ukraine, including relatively recently when a few were damaged and burned down at Junkoy as a result of presumably ATACMS missile strike. This was last week or the week before, wasn't it? So the question of the degree to which sea and air routes will be closed is perhaps more of an open question than previously assumed, which then does, relatively speaking, lower the importance of the Suwalki Gap. Obviously, heavy forces need to go through the Suwalki Gap, or by sea. You're not going to fly an Abrams in by air. That's just not going to happen. But also, what we've seen is that Kaliningrad, at least for the moment, has been largely emptied of Russian troops. The S-400s are gone, mostly at least, The 11th Army Corps, which was stationed there, is gone. This is one of the formations which has been suffering quite heavily in Ukraine, including being quite battered as a result of the Kharkiv counteroffensive of September 2022. So at the moment, the Baltic sort of flank is very much denuded of Russian forces. The other Russian forces of note being the 76th Guards Air Assault Division, which was based in Pskov, is currently stationed around Robotyne in Zaporizhia province. So with this, and given how questions about Belarus's value as an ally for Russia in any sort of war context, it is perhaps questionable to what degree the Russians can actually threaten the Suwalki positions. I'm trying to avoid labeling it as either a gap or a corridor. But obviously, this is still a problem which it makes sense to think more rather than less about anyway. Because if you don't think about it and you're wrong, then the consequences are bad. Whereas if you think about it and you're wrong and nothing happens, then you've wasted a bit of brain power, but so what? But I do feel like potentially it might be a bit less important and a bit less of a challenge than believed prior to the Russian reinvasion of Ukraine.
And I guess you also do have Poland there on the other side that has a strategic culture that's probably quite similar to that of the Baltic states, and that probably, unless it's attacked itself, wouldn't just let Russia take over the Suwalki corridor and just close it.
Certainly. Was it the Polish president who recently, or the prime minister, I don't remember, one or the other recently said in the past couple of weeks, I don't know when this podcast will be going out, but so early April, that he could not imagine Poland not coming to the defense of Lithuania. So essentially, this seems to be that the prospect of non-action is out as a policy option. So the Poles will come to the rescue, at least of Lithuania, but that can have knock-on effects. And moreover, even if the Poles just threaten Kaliningrad, that's probably enough, even after the eventual end of the war between Russia and Ukraine, and the 11th Army Corps goes back to Kaliningrad and is reconstituted. The Polish threat to Kaliningrad is probably sufficient to pin down the 11th Army Corps sufficiently that they cannot then also undertake substantial offensive actions into Lithuania. So even without going to Lithuania itself, the Poles could contribute in a way which prevents the Russians from probably taking Suwalki.
And I guess for Poles, the equation is pretty simple, that basically when the Baltics are threatened, and if the Baltics were about to fall, that would not just present a huge security risk for them, but it also would mean that they are kind of the next in line.
Yes, they would be the next in line. Depending on Belarusian attitudes towards allowing another Russian invasion through their territory, they might be next in line anyway. But nonetheless, that's a different topic.
Do you think it would make sense from Russian perspective to, if, and you know, we're talking about hypothetical scenarios, but if that was to happen, would it make sense to attack Poland simultaneously with the Baltics? Because that's what I assume you were implying.
Yes, that relates to a couple of factors. One is, do the Russians trust the Belarusians enough to launch another invasion from Belarusian territory? Because if you think back to the initial months of the war, when there was the one Russian axis of advance coming down toward Kyiv from Belarusian territory, there was some degree of Belarusian sabotage from the partisan movement. of Russian logistics. It's impossible to say at the moment, and certainly maybe with 20 years hindsight we might know more, how impactful that was actually on Russian logistics and the Russian ability to sustain its offensive. But I'm certain the Russians wouldn't have been happy about that. So would they want to potentially repeat the experience against NATO, a more important war, or certainly a higher stakes war? That's an open question. But in any case, if they don't engage the Poles, that might in principle enable more Polish forces to filter through into the Baltic states and help defend the Baltic states. So there's a sense in which they'll probably have to face the Polish forces somewhere anyway. It's just a case of engaging with them either in Poland, and incidentally, Suwalki is in Poland, so they'd be engaging with Polish forces in Poland anyway if they go to Suwalki itself, or they face them in the Baltic states. So it doesn't make too huge of a difference in principle. In operational details, sure, in terms of the relative ability to sustain forces and these sorts of things. But there's going to be shooting between Poles and Russians anyway.
So I guess in for a penny, in for a pound, as the British say.
Maybe.
But I think getting back to the Baltics, I wanted to dig a little deeper into the issue of or the scenario of their defense. And you've already mentioned that there would be the expectation that they might need to just try to hold on part of the country until a larger NATO force arrives eventually. So how reliant are the Baltics actually on NATO, and to what extent it matters that they're putting in the effort into increasing their military expenditures and trying to increase the size of their militaries when they do have the huge advantage of just having a very small population. Just for the context, population of Estonia is I think 1.5 million. So the amount of people that they can bring to arms is very limited.
Yeah, so I mean, ultimately, the Baltic states can only be extremely reliant on their NATO allies. The Baltic states alone cannot stop a full-scale Russian attack. Not even if the enhanced forward presence brigades, once you get to brigade level, participate as well. That said, just a few days ago, as of this recording, the Estonian military chief, General Martin Herem, publicly stated that he was confident that Estonia could win a war. Presumably he meant this war. Now, it's good to be optimistic, but that might perhaps be a bit much. But on the assumption the Baltic states, with current NATO forces, cannot defend themselves, the Baltic front would need to be reinforced. So a lot of thinking, and especially prior to 2022, but I think even still today, focuses on the question of time. How to ensure that there is enough time to reinforce. Now, part of this is speeding up the process of reinforcement through improving mobilization processes, improving logistics and transportation, and so on, but also by improving Baltic defense forces and Baltic defense infrastructure so that they can fight longer and delay the Russians. This does include the starting or the plans for the Baltic defense line, which are basically focused on, they're at the border, so demonstrating the commitment, not just by the Baltic states, but by NATO as a whole, to defend every inch of alliance territory. Maybe not literally every inch as it turns out, probably, but nonetheless, right there at the border to hold the line. And because if you can hold the Russians at the border or delay them at the border, that means a greater chance for Baltic civilians to escape from the fighting and that sort of stuff. And really, the defensive posture in the Baltic states can really only be this way, be fundamentally about buying as much time as possible, unless NATO does station even more forces in the Baltic states. And here I'm thinking of back in 2016, the American think tank RAND published a report about a Baltic defense war game which they played out. And here, as part of their recommendations, they recommended 6 to 7 brigades be stationed in the Baltic states, or additional brigades, including 3 heavy brigades, so armored brigades. And that this posture was sufficient if supported by NATO sea power, air power, and other adequate combat enablers to avoid losing the war in the first few days. Now, this was a very pessimistic report. Earlier this year, they did reflect on the war game and suggested that, in light of watching Russian military performance in Ukraine over the past couple of years, they did overestimate the Russian army's tactical competence and felt that the rules of the war game did not adequately reflect non-material factors. So really just about sheer number of men, sheer number of guns, this sort of stuff. And that is, I think, probably fair enough. It is hard to model those things. But it is also undeniable that compared to a year, and especially compared to 2 years ago, the Russian army is getting better. It knows how to do things, which it was very ineffective at doing before. Sort of qualitatively, its equipment is to some degree deteriorating. The quality of its manpower is deteriorating, but the surviving elements of the army are getting better at doing what they do. And NATO would still need considerable heavy forces to be able to defend, or, at worst, to liberate the Baltic states effectively. And probably, and perhaps probably also controversially, I think it's fair to say that our Western armed forces are not as competent as we usually think that they are. Not in major warfare. The last time any Western armed force had experienced a major warfare was over 20 years ago, and that was the invasion of Iraq. Prior to that, it was the Gulf War, and so on and so forth. We don't do it that often. The West, and especially Europe, was unprepared for a conflict at this scale. Other analysts have noted the probability of European countries running out of ammunition after a couple of weeks of high-intensity warfare. And that's probably true for pretty much every single European country. And that doesn't really instill confidence as a sign of substantial competence. So, yes, we laugh at the Russian army, but some more cautious commentators have been saying that if we were in their position, at least in certain scenarios, we wouldn't necessarily do much better. And that is a bit worrisome.
I think maybe you've hinted on another scenario that's worth talking about that I've heard before, and which sort of emphasizes why all this is so important, and that's that Russians might try to basically take the entire Baltic territory, or most of it, as fast as possible, even if they incur quite large losses, and then basically bog down and hold it as hard as they can, and even threaten with nuclear escalation, and sort of assume that since liberating and gaining more territory for NATO would be much harder than defending it, they would just sort of and they wouldn't want to risk the nuclear threat, which has turned out to be quite effective so far. The basically threatening with nuclear escalation, that NATO would just give up and not continue pushing forward to liberate the Baltics.
Yes, I mean, this notion has been bounced around to a fair degree. It does rely on a not entirely accurate reading of Russian nuclear strategy debates. And so the notion of sort of escalating to de-escalate, that is very much a Western caricature of sort of Russian nuclear thinking at the moment. Current Russian nuclear thinking is more in line with notions of escalation management and how do you manage escalation, to a considerable degree, drawing from Western and especially American nuclear strategic thought of like the 1950s and 1960s. So these are ideas which are not actually new to us in sort of broad generic terms. It's just that this is the first time we're kind of on the receiving end of them, and that's perhaps made us a bit panicked. As for how credible the threat of nuclear weapons is, I mean, it's really hard to tell. I mean, once you get into nuclear strategic theory, then it just all gets so hypothetical because the stakes just get so high so quickly that it all just basically boils down to, well, would they really? And you can't really overcome those basic doubts. And this is sort of part of the point with, I mean, over the past 2 years, Russia has made a lot of nuclear threats and drawn a number of red lines, many of which, most of which, almost all of which probably, have been crossed by NATO. Tanks were a red line until tanks showed up in Ukraine and nothing happened and so on and so forth. Backed by nuclear threats, usually, not exclusively, but usually conveyed by Medvedev, who has taken to basically being Russia's barking dog when it comes to nuclear threats. That's what his role is these days. And the more they make these threats, the less credible they are. Because why would it be more credible now if you said the same thing 20 times earlier and it turned out not to be credible? So it's really hard to say. And again, and then the other part, the trying to conquer the Baltics quickly, this is sort of what I was talking about in terms of being able to impose delays on Russian forces. And we've seen that for countries in places where you can impose delays on Russian forces, if you have sufficient firepower, sufficient mass, how quickly does the Russian army go? Here I'm thinking of Avdiivka, for example. How long did it take the Russians actually to take Avdiivka? They battered against that small town for virtually half a year before actually taking it. And if the Baltic states, with the NATO allies already embedded in the enhanced forward presence groups, could delay the Russians by even half that time or a third of that time, that's enough time for NATO to come to the rescue. So again, and this goes back to the notion of strategic depth. You can't talk about strategic depth without talking about the resistance to invasion. If you put up sufficiently strong resistance, then you can turn those 35 or 90 or 240 kilometers or whatever into something which feels a lot longer than that.
And I guess that is a good point or this is a good moment to talk about the newly announced Baltic defense line, because that would, I assume, play a major role in slowing down the Russian invasion. And I think that's really interesting because, to me, it sort of echoes the even World War II or pre-World War II Maginot Line, and Czechoslovakia had a similar kind of a line to defend from Nazi Germany. So would it resemble, would it resemble those lines that we've seen in the 1930s, and how big of a role do Baltics think that this would play?
Well, I mean, I don't know enough about the fortifications in Czechoslovakia to say anything intelligent about that. But the Maginot Line was really, really sort of the work of art almost. Like they had battleship caliber guns there and stuff like that. You're not going to have anything like that with the Baltic defense line. It's going to be sort of focused on, or from sort of the plans we've seen and what's been shared, the notion is having bunkers, each of which can hold a squad, maybe a platoon, and then connected via trenches, and then having supporting trenches and supply points and this sort of stuff, with the notion, with the thought that more movable fortification elements would be put out only if hostility seemed likely. So things like barbed wire and mines and dragon's teeth. And so the point here is that these fortifications are really there. I mean, ideally, if they can defend, if they can enable the Baltic states to defend their own countries, then that'd be ideal. But at the very least, they could help slow down a Russian invasion. So the ideal is there, but in prospective hypothetical practice, it's just going to be part of buying time.
On the notion of basically increasing the defenses, in which I imagine, as we've talked before, then the NATO forces would play a major role. I spoke with General Richard Shirev some time ago. He was on the podcast, who's the former Deputy Supreme Commander of NATO, and he wrote a book called War with Russia. I assume you've read it, which is a basically fictional scenario of exactly what we're talking about, of Russia attacking the Baltics and succeeding. And I spoke with him recently, and his argument was that the forward presence that's in NATO today, even though it was increased, is still incredibly small compared with, the size of what Russia could muster and what kind of an invading force would probably look like, and that it would function as a tripwire, or hopefully it would function as a tripwire, but it wouldn't actually do much to slow the Russians down. But then again, you do have the argument that I've also heard that Russia needed months, or at least it took months before the invasion of Ukraine to sort of put all the forces on the border. And given the amount of intelligence that the West had, we knew, or at least the U.S. intelligence services knew, that it's going to happen. So my question is, which of these two opinions or arguments do you lean more towards? And do you think that if the Russian invasion were to happen, they would do it the same way as in Ukraine, where they would sort of put a large number of forces on the border, and it wouldn't be entirely clear whether it's just an exercise or whether they're going to really attack this time? Thank you for listening to this conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest of it, you can find it on my Patreon. Click the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics. And if you decide to become a supporter, you get bonus content, Patreon-only episodes, and you will be able to ask questions to my future guests. And here's what you can see in the bonus part. What is your assessment of the level of risk of this very hypothetical scenario?
Is it going to be an invasion? Because, would they really? Are they really so stupid as to attack NATO? Surely not, sort of thing. And that is basically engaging in a certain degree of wishful thinking. But the fundamental European nightmare is war between the US and China. Because then the US will have no ability, really, to support Europe at all. And given that Europe's ability to defend itself is somewhat questionable, then that would leave things uncomfortably open.